Okay, it is time for us to begin our Bible study. Open your Bibles, if you will, to Matthew chapter 24 as we begin our study of God's Word, which is part of the spiritual growth process. Worship God, study His Word, love one another, and reach the lost. And we do that so that we might grow to the glory of God. So we are in the final week of Jesus, and we have been studying the events that were occurring on Tuesday, the day of conflict of that final week. We've been on that same day for several of our classes, and this is coming to the end of that day. And Jesus, of course, has had so many conflicts with the Pharisees and the scribes and the chief priests and the Sadducees. And in chapter 23 of Matthew, Jesus just really lets the Pharisees and the scribes have it. And he said, I want to read verses 34 through 36. He said, "Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." This passage right here really leads into our study of Matthew 24. He's saying in that passage that we just looked at, you mistreated God's prophets, and as a result, the blood of those prophets is going to come on this generation. God is going to bring retribution for that. And in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus prophesies the destruction of Jerusalem. So we're going to be studying that this morning as well as on Wednesday night. I don't have any one takeaway except for Jesus prophesies the destruction of Jerusalem. That's a takeaway enough. It's faith building, and it just helps put so many pieces together and make sense of so much. So we're going to be studying this. Let me make a couple of comments first. If you have any comments you want to make or any questions, then text the number on the screen. I'm not going to be doing my normal format where I ask leading questions and we purposefully have discussions. I'm not going to do that today. There's so much for me to cover. This is going to be more of a lecture. But if you do have any comments, if you do have any questions, then feel free to text that number, and if I have time, I'll try to get to some of those this morning. Before we dive into the text here, we need to talk about why this topic of the destruction of Jerusalem is so important. The Jews, once they left Egypt, went to Mount Sinai, and in Exodus 19, they agreed to God's covenant. They became God's covenant people. And through the years that followed, God protected them from their enemies. He guided them with the law. He placed His presence with them, first in the tabernacle and then in the temple. And sadly, they did not serve Him. And they rebelled against Him just generation after generation. And as a punishment for their rejection of Himself, He allowed that first temple to be destroyed in 586 BC, and He allowed His people to be taken into captivity in Babylon, and that lasted for 70 years. Now, after that captivity, we all know our Bible history. God allowed a remnant to return to Jerusalem, and they rebuilt the temple. They built another temple. It wasn't anything like Solomon's temple. It wasn't near the glory of that temple, but they did rebuild a temple, and God was with His people, but sadly they still failed to live up to His plan for them. And so after the 400 years of silence, when God sent His Son into the world, He was sending them the Messiah. He was sending them their deliverance. He was sending them the greatest blessing that He ever offered them, and the Jewish nation as a whole rejected this greatest blessing that was offered to them. And it is a result of that rejection that God is going to destroy Jerusalem. He did destroy Jerusalem in year 70 AD. And so the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple was God's rejection of the Jews as His covenant people. Not that Jews can't be saved, but no longer would the Jews be His covenant people. The covenant people would be the Israel of God, the church. And Jews and Gentiles can be saved in that kingdom through Jesus Christ. So that's kind of a big picture background as to why this topic is so important and why the destruction of Jerusalem happened. So having said all of that, let's delve into the first section. We're going to be in Matthew's account, obviously, and so let's just first read verses 1 through 3. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when His disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to Him. And He said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone will be left upon another which will not be torn down." As He was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to Him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So it mentions there in verse 1 that He came out from the temple. This is the last time that He is going to be in the temple. He's not going to return to the temple again. And there may be even something symbolic here of His leaving of the temple connected with Ezekiel 10 and the Spirit of God leaving the temple. But at this point, apparently He's just outside the temple complex with His disciples at this first part of this conversation. And they're just pointing out the temple buildings to Him. They're so impressed. The temple complex was a beautiful structure. This is a model of it. I want to read an excerpt from a book called Matthew 24, First Century Fulfillment or End Time Expectation by a man named Stanley Paher. It says, "Jerusalem was a city of royal palaces, imposing walls, gates, and fine houses. Apart from other structures and isolated in grandeur stood the impressive 19-acre Temple Mount, with its several courts, porches, and balconies rising in a series of terraces. It had splendid colonnades and gold and silver covered gates, posts, and lintels. Topping it all was the gleaming marble cloistered cedar roof of the temple. The two-chambered sanctuary looked like a mountain covered with snow, for any roof not covered with dazzling white marble was stoutly plated with gold. From afar, the roof reflected such a fierce blaze that, in Josephus's words, those who endeavored to look at it were forced to turn away as if they had looked straight at the sun. Indeed, the magnificent buildings evoked the glorious admiration of both Jews and Gentiles of that day as a perfect specimen of craftsmanship. For art and beauty, they were collectively a true ancient wonder which surely would endure for generations upon end." In other words, there at the end of that reading, nobody would have expected the temple to be destroyed. It seemed as permanent as anything could seem. It was absolutely phenomenal. Herod the Great, he was known for his various works of architecture, and they were magnificent. He really began the building of this temple. It started as really a reconstruction of that second temple that was built back in the time of Nehemiah, but that started in 20 BC. The construction of the temple that you're looking at on the screen was still going on in the days of Christ and would continue for the next 3 decades. It was a magnificent structure, a huge undertaking. In Mark's gospel, listen to what the disciples said. "Teacher, behold what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." Mark emphasizes that they were impressed with the stones. Stones were magnificent. There are still some portions of the temple complex that were left intact. Here's the Golden Gate. That was the eastern entrance, the main entrance into that temple complex. And you can see just how magnificent those stones, some of those stones were the original ones. Here we see the Temple Mount southeastern corner, and just look at how large some of those stones were near the foundation. Here's a close-up of the Temple Mount arch and gate on the southeastern side. Again, look how large these stones were. Herod was known for that. Here's the Temple Mount northeastern tower. In our book, Waldron notes that some of these stones were as wide as 24 feet. Josephus said that some of them were 40 feet wide, which is almost certainly an exaggeration, but they were huge, just absolutely huge. So here the disciples, they're so impressed with all of this. And that's when Jesus drops this bombshell. He said, the time's going to come where there's not one stone left on another. Now, that wasn't a literal statement. That was a proverbial and a figurative expression. It also seems to have been a reversal of the statement that Haggai made of the building of the temple in Haggai 2:15. One stone was placed on another in the temple of the Lord. Jesus said, well, there's going to come a time where there's not going to be one stone left upon another. Again, this hyperbolic statement of just total devastation. Total devastation. They didn't see this coming, even though the Old Testament prophesied Jerusalem would be destroyed and the temple would be destroyed. They didn't understand that. They had no concept of that, apparently, and this totally blew them away. And so they continued moving away from the temple as they were traveling toward Bethany, and they went through the Kidron Valley and up to the crest of Mount Olivet. And from Mount Olivet, as I talked about when we talked about the entrance of Jesus, the final entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, you just see a really beautiful view of all of Jerusalem. And here we see a panoramic shot of what you would see in the place Jesus was here if you were looking toward Jerusalem. Where that mosque is about where the temple, just about where the temple was. And so it's in this setting, with that view before them, the sun likely setting behind the city as they were looking towards it, that the disciples came to him. Mark tells us it was Peter, Andrew, James, and John, those fishermen from Galilee, that asked this specific question. I think it's two questions. And they came to him privately because nobody wanted to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. And so they didn't want this to be, something that everybody heard them asking about. And so they probably whispered this question or these questions. And here are the questions. And this is significant. This is very important for us to establish what the questions were in order to really understand what Jesus is saying later. First question is, when will these things happen? That is, when will these temple buildings be destroyed? And of course, if the temple buildings are destroyed, that means the whole city is going to be destroyed. But when? When is that going to happen? They're concerned about that. Is that something that's going to be way, way, way off in the future? Is it going to happen really soon? When is it going to happen? Spoiler alert, Jesus answers that point blank in verse 34, where he says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." And so that helps us to see that Jesus is not talking about the end times in Matthew 24. He's not talking about, the rapture and all of these things that so many sensational sermons have been preached on by false teachers across the land. No, he's talking here about something that will happen in their generation in Matthew 24, at least up until about that point in Matthew 24. I'll talk about that in a second. So that was the first question. When are these things going to happen? So Jesus answers that. And their second question was, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now we need to try to get into their head for a second. They were not asking about Jesus' second coming. It does not seem to me that they had a concept of the second coming of Christ. They didn't even understand that he was going to die. I mean, just a few days earlier in Luke 18, Jesus told them in no uncertain terms, I'm going to die in Jerusalem, I'm going to be resurrected, and Luke tells us they did not understand what he was saying. If they don't understand that he's even going to die, then they surely don't understand the concept of a second coming. So when they talk about the sign of your coming, I think they're talking about a spiritual coming of Jesus. This kind of coming, perhaps, that we talked about in the Lord's Supper sermon in Daniel 7, when Jesus came and was presented to the Ancient of Days and received this great kingdom, this eternal kingdom. I think they're asking about a spiritual coming of Christ, and they're connecting that with the destruction of Jerusalem in their mind. And in fact, as we will see, Jesus did come, this spiritual coming in the destruction of Jerusalem. It was a coming of Jesus in that kind of a sense. We'll talk about that much more on Wednesday. The second part of that second question, what will be the sign of the end of the age? You have to understand, the Old Testament prophesied about the age that is to come. That age that is to come will be a time of this new heavens and new earth. It will be a time where righteousness dwells. It will be a time when everyone knows Yahweh. And so they, knowing the Old Testament, were putting this all together, the destruction of Jerusalem with the end of the age and the ushering in of this grand new age that would come, this new heavens and earth. And so I think they were mistaken in some of their thinking there. Certainly when Jerusalem was destroyed, that did not usher in the new age. We are still a part of that today. Jesus told His apostles, preach the gospel to all creation, and lo, I am with you always to the end of the age. And He didn't mean until 70 AD. He meant to the end of time when that new age is going to come. But in their mind, it seems that they were connecting the destruction of Jerusalem with the end of the age. And what Jesus is going to do is He's going to tell them about the destruction of Jerusalem, but He's also going to talk about the end of the age as well. Let me present to you the two plausible views of Matthew 24. I say plausible because there is a lot more views than these that are not plausible. These are, in my view, the two that are plausible. The first one is the destruction of Jerusalem view, and that is that all of Matthew 24 is about the destruction of Jerusalem from beginning to end. That's the view that I hold. The second view is the destruction of Jerusalem and the second coming view. And that is the view that Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem up until verse 36. In verse 36, He says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone." And so it's argued that after that point, He starts talking about His actual second coming. That's a view that I used to hold, and honestly, there's not a lot of difference between views 1 and 2 here. There's just not a lot of difference. And let me say this too, regardless of which of those two views you hold, when Jesus talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, He uses language that can apply to the second coming. Some of the language that He uses can also be applied to the second coming, because the destruction of Jerusalem was a foreshadowing of His second coming. And so, either view you take, I think we can all agree that Matthew 25 is a discussion of things that will happen at the very end, at Jesus' second coming. And we have to understand, the whole speech is not Matthew 24. The Olivet Discourse is 24 and 25. So really, in this whole speech, He does start out talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and then at some point He transitions to where He is talking about the end of time. Again, because the destruction of Jerusalem is a foreshadowing of what will happen when Jesus does return in the end. So I hope that clarifies some things for you. So let's move forward now in our study of this same section that we started. I'll just kind of pause here for a second. I haven't gotten any questions on my phone yet, but do any of you guys have any comments or questions at this point you want to mention? Okay. All right, well, we'll go on now. Verse 4, we'll start reading there. "And Jesus answered and said to them, and this is the beginning of the Olivet Discourse, see to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So, going back up there to verses 4 and 5, we see that he starts this discourse by warning them not to listen to false Christs. There will be many who will come saying, I am the Christ. Now, that didn't mean that they were saying, I'm Jesus, as we understand Jesus, but they would be saying, I am the Messiah. I'm the one prophesied in the Old Testament. And by the way, what did the Jews understand that the Messiah would do? Usher in this geopolitical messianic kingdom. That's how they understood the kingdom. And so when people would come claiming to be the Christ, then that was seen as a revolt against Rome. It was a revolt against Rome because they were seeking to establish their own earthly kind of a kingdom. And so Rome cracked down on those false messiahs. Josephus mentions that around the time of the end of Nero's reign, which ended in 68, year 68, that's 2 years before Jerusalem would be destroyed, that so many impostors emerged that they were apprehended and killed daily, which is probably an exaggeration, as Josephus tends to do sometimes, but it still indicates that there were lots of false Christs at this time. In verse 6, Jesus says, you're going to hear about wars and rumors of wars. Let's talk about revolts that happened in Rome leading up to 70 A.D. After Nero committed suicide in 68, a brief Roman civil war followed. There were small revolts all over that world empire. You would have been hearing about wars and rumors of wars all the time. In fact, after Nero died, he was replaced by Galba, who was emperor for only 7 months. And he was murdered by Otho, who became emperor for 3 months. When he was defeated by Vitellius, Otho committed suicide. Vitellius was emperor for 8 months, and then he was murdered by Vespasian, and Vespasian was emperor for a while. The year of AD 69 is known as the year of 4 emperors. There was a lot of unrest throughout the empire, a lot of wars. In verse 7, Jesus says at the end of the verse, there will be famines and there will be earthquakes. So let's talk about famines for a second. There were 4 famines during the reign of Claudius. Claudius was the emperor that came before Nero. And so that's, I think, leading up to like year 54. There were 4 different famines during his reign. One of them we read about in the book of Acts. There were more famines in Italy and in Judea and in Greece in the years that followed that. Food was scarce in Palestine between years 68 and 70. There was a lot of famine going on. Exactly what Jesus said to expect as a sign that, yes, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. The temple is going to be destroyed. What about earthquakes there at the end of verse 7? Well, there was an earthquake in Asia Minor in 61 AD that destroyed part of Laodicea and some surrounding areas there in Asia Minor. There was a very catastrophic earthquake that did a lot of damage to Pompeii in year 62. And there were also some mid-first century earthquakes in various places. Crete, Smyrna, Miletus, and some other places as well. So Jesus is saying, when you start experiencing all of these different things, you need to realize that the time of the destruction of Jerusalem is not yet, but it's coming. It's, as he said, the beginning of birth pangs. There's going to be more birth pangs that will follow. In verse 9, he says that they will deliver you to tribulation. They will kill you. You'll be hated by all. We don't have to look any further than the book of Acts to see this persecution that Jesus prophesied here. In the book of Acts, Peter and John were arrested in Acts 4. All the apostles were arrested in Acts 5, flogged. We also see Stephen in Acts 7 being stoned to death. In Acts 12, James the apostle was executed by Herod, and Peter was put in prison. And then, of course, Paul was beaten. He was stoned in Lystra and imprisoned for years. And so we see all of this tribulation happening in the book of Acts to these Christians. By the way, these were Jewish Christians. And also we could talk about Nero's persecution in years 64 and 65 that just involved unimaginable torture of Christians. They would clothe Christians with animal skins and feed them to wild, starved dogs. They would tie them to posts and have them dipped in tar or oil and light them on fire to illuminate the gardens of Nero. Just unimaginable torture and death. Jesus prophesied that that's what would happen. I mean, I don't know about you, but this study is very faith-building to me. Very faith-building to me. False prophets talked about there in verse 11. Many false prophets would come. We see that in the New Testament in various places. Verse 12, most people's love will grow cold. Verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. When it says all the nations, we need to understand that in the context that means the nations of the Mediterranean world. And so Jesus, gave the Great Commission to His apostles to go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. And in year 62, when Paul wrote the book of Colossians, listen to what Paul said to them. He talked in Colossians 1:23 about the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, was made a minister. So by 62 A.D., the Great Commission had been fulfilled. The gospel had spread to all the known world. And so Jesus said there in Matthew 24 and verse 15, that's going to happen before Jerusalem is destroyed. And then the end will come. It's kind of interesting. The word end there is a different word than is used earlier when the disciples were asking about the end of the age. That could be translated the consummation of the age, right? But here, this is the word teleos. It means the end. I think he's talking about the end of Jerusalem will come and all that comes along with that. I'm going to pause here before we go into our next section. I did get one comment on my phone here. This is Brenda or Dave. It's true that the temple itself was completely torn down, correct? Maybe not all the surrounding structures, but the temple was destroyed. Well, there are two different words for temple, and one refers to the sanctuary, and one refers to that 19-acre complex. Jesus was referring to the 19-acre complex. And, it's kind of interesting, Titus, he didn't want all the buildings totally destroyed. He wanted to siege Jerusalem, and he wanted to capture the city, but he wanted to save the magnificent structures of Herod. But there was such a fury going on at the time. His soldiers were so caught up in everything that was going on that they burned the temple, and he didn't want them to. And so the temple was destroyed. And after everything was burned, Titus, and he was the general, he did command his soldiers to basically just rake everything, the foundations and all. And so only 3 towers remained. And so we do see places where there are stones on top of another. That's why we can't take that statement of Jesus literally earlier when he said not one stone will be left upon another. That, as I said, is a proverbial statement. It's used a few times in the Old Testament of different judgments of God where it says nothing like this ever happened, nothing like this will ever happen. And we can't take that completely literally because it happened more than once. And that's the case with Jerusalem. But it was absolutely horrific. Good question. Hope my answer made a little bit of sense. Did any of y'all have any questions? Brian?
Well, it's more of a comment. It's so helpful to see how all this happened even before 70 AD. Like, for instance, I was at the mall having a study with some people, and a guy walked up to the table. He saw us studying, and he was like, "Man, I'm so glad you guys are studying the Bible. I mean, have you been reading the news? There's just, with all this stuff in the Middle East, and the wars, and the famines, and all, like, we are in the end times, he's coming soon." And it's just a misreading, it's so common, of Matthew 24, because there always have been those things, and there always will be those things until the end of time.
Exactly. Yeah, Brian makes a really good point, and hopefully everybody can hear him now. We have some mics set up, so I don't necessarily have to repeat that. But that's so true. We have to be careful with this chapter and not sensationalize it and turn it into just an end times prophecy, but see the fulfillment in the destruction of Jerusalem first. Very good. Anybody else? All right. So now we press forward. We're going to try to get through verse 28 today. So let's read 15 through 28. Jesus said, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, 'Behold, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, 'Behold, he is in the wilderness,' do not go out. Or, 'Behold, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." All right, so there's some language here. It's a little difficult for us to talk about here. First of all, there in verse 15, he talks about this abomination of desolation. What is that about? Well, he specifically says, which was spoken of through Daniel, the prophet. In Daniel chapter 9, Daniel is praying because he realizes the 70 years of Babylonian captivity are up. And he's praying fervently for forgiveness for himself and the nation. He's praying that God would restore Jerusalem and restore the sanctuary. And God sends the angel Gabriel, who gives him this amazing prophecy that, yes, the temple and the city will be rebuilt, but after a pretty long period of time, the Messiah will come. The Messiah will be cut off. That means he will be killed. And the temple will be destroyed yet again. And the city, it will be destroyed again. And at the very end of that prophecy, here's what Gabriel told Daniel. On the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. Even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So the making desolate there means making Jerusalem desolate, destroying it. And the abominations means doing something that is considered by God to be abominable, doing something that God absolutely is disgusted by. And so Jesus here says, when you see the abomination standing in the holy place. Now, we just don't know what is the fulfillment of what Jesus said there. There were various times when the temple was desecrated. In the first century, there was more than one time. So we can't be totally sure what this is, but I think Luke 21 does help us here. Luke 21 and verse 20 says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. So it's connected there. That is not talking about the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, but specifically the armies surrounding Jerusalem. Well, starting in year 66, the Jews began to revolt against Rome. And so there was a series of wars and battles between the Jews and Rome, which really stretched on for many years. But it started in year 66. And so there would have been times when you'd have Rome coming out against Jerusalem. And so Jesus says, when you see the armies, know that, look, this is not going to end well. You're not going to be victorious over Rome. Rome is going to crush you. And so get out, flee, and hurry. That's what Jesus is saying. In verse 16, he says, and those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Mountains would be a place of great refuge. Eusebius, the 4th century Christian historian, tells us that Jews who believed in Christ, they fled in the years preceding the destruction of Jerusalem, and they went up and then crossed over the Jordan into the area of Perea to the city of Pella. Here's a couple of shots of Pella. You see the mountains? It would have been a wonderful safe haven, a wonderful refuge. And we know historically that that's what happened. Why? Because Jesus told his disciples, when you see all these things happen, get out of Dodge. I mean, that's not what his words were, but get out of the city. And so many of them listened and did that very thing. Said at verse 17, whoever's on the housetop, don't go back in your house. Don't even go back in your house. I mean, that's how much of a hurry you need to be in. Houses typically on the roof had a kind of a floor of their own where, you could go up there and recline and people would spend time on the roofs. So if you're on the housetop and you saw these armies coming and everything, well, you need to get out quickly. Don't even go back in your home. And houses, at that time, they typically had a stairway on the outside of the home so that you didn't have to go back inside to come down from the roof. You could just go right down and run and escape. He says, if someone's in the field, don't go back to get his cloak. If this were talking about Jesus' second coming, what application would this have? It would have no application. It wouldn't. Why would you need to flee? There's no fleeing of Christ when he comes in that final day. There's no reason to flee. And the ones here who are told to flee are the righteous ones, the ones who listen to Jesus' words. It says in verse 19, woe to those who are pregnant. Woe to those who are nursing babies. Again, what application would that have in the end? Would have no application. But when Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, if you were pregnant, that's going to mean it's harder for you to travel. You got nursing little ones, it's going to be harder for you guys to get out of the city. Pray that your flight, verse 20, may not be in the winter. Why? It's hard to travel in the winter. What about when he says, pray that your flight may not be on the Sabbath? Well, you're not supposed to travel very far on the Sabbath, and the gates of the city were closed because nobody went anywhere on the Sabbath. So if it were on the Sabbath, you would be trapped inside the city. Verse 21, he says, then there will be a great tribulation. Great tribulation. And this is not talking about some end times great tribulation. It's talking about the tribulation that happened when Jerusalem was destroyed. And I may go into this more on Wednesday night, but the atrocities that happened in Jerusalem when Jerusalem was destroyed are just unbelievable. The things that humans did to one another. You know, the Romans, they starved out the Jews. And when they started running low on food, everybody was stealing from one another. They were killing one another, trying to get food from one another. They were doing some really desperate things in order to get any morsel of food, biting into leather and eating whatever they could get their hands on. It was really sad. You even had cannibalism happening at this time. Just the suffering, and I don't even want to go into the details really because they're kind of morbid. But when you read, like Josephus, he's just got dozens of pages on all of the atrocities that happened in the destruction of Jerusalem. It's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. Such has not occurred since the beginning of time, nor ever will. As I was talking about earlier, that's a proverbial statement. It's hyperbolic. It's extreme language for the point of emphasis. Same language is found in Jeremiah 20 and Joel 2 and Ezekiel 5. Verse 23 he says, if anyone says to you, here's the Christ, or there he is, don't believe him. So he's coming back to what he started with the Olivet Discourse talking about. So much emphasis here on don't listen to those false Christs at the time. And kind of skipping forward a little bit, verse 27, just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. I think we just need to be careful not to try to make too much of what he's saying. You know, lightning comes fast. It comes quickly. It's kind of mysterious. And I think that's what he's saying about his coming. And when we say his coming, what we mean is the symbolic coming of Jesus in the destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 28, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. I want to comment on this and then see if anybody else has some comments. If you do have comments or questions, now's the time to go ahead and be typing them on your phone. But the word that is translated vultures can also be translated eagles. It seems that our translators translate it vultures because it talks about corpses and these birds are gathering where the corpses are, and what kind of birds do that? Well, vultures do that, and so that seems to be the logical reason why they would put vultures in there. But I would argue that perhaps the word eagles should be the word that is there instead of vultures. Let me tell you why. An aquila, which is Latin for eagle, was a prominent symbol used in ancient Rome, especially as a standard of a Roman legion. Show you a couple of pictures here. This is a Roman ornament with an aquila on it, with the eagle on it. Here we see a relief showing Aquila from the Arch of Claudius. You can see there in the upper left portion of that image, the eagle. This is a denarius minted by Mark Antony to pay his legions, and on that right side, if you can make that out, that is an eagle, that's an aquila. And so perhaps what Jesus is saying is where the corpse is, there the eagles will gather. Again, a reference to the coming in of the Roman armies. Seems to be the meaning to me. Terry Petty asked, why does Jesus reference praying about this time to flee not being on a Sabbath? Did the early Christians observe the Sabbath? I think that it would be more because the gates of the city would be closed on the Sabbath. As far as the early Christians observing the Sabbath, if it were Jews, if it were Christians in Jerusalem, many of those would be Jewish Christians. And many of them did continue to observe the Sabbath. Even after, there was that was a big deal, right? The whole transition between the old law and the new law. And even some of them, even when they understood that we don't have to, they still did it as a custom, as Paul did. But I think that it would be a combination of the two, Terry, the gates of the city being closed on the Sabbath, and some that still were observing the Sabbath, even though they didn't have to, whether they understood that or not. We're out of time, but we don't have a bell, so we can go a little
I was
long.
going to throw one more thing.
Please.
They were very conscious about how far they had to travel on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And so, they had that whole Sabbath day journey thing. So they're going to have to take long travel leaving the city, and so that's part of it too. Might bother their conscience.
Yes. Well, yes. If they had any kind of desire to observe the Sabbath, then there were restrictions on how far you could travel on the Sabbath too. Okay, I think we're pretty much out of time. I hope all of that was helpful to you. I found it to be immensely helpful to me. I enjoyed putting all that together. Well, I didn't enjoy putting it together as much as I did presenting it, I'll be honest. All right, please read through page 152A, and we're going to finish our study of Matthew 24. I encourage you to study that. Study the rest of Matthew 24. Don't just read it. Please just really study it, look into it, cross-reference things, and also look at the other synoptics and what they said as well. And at this time, we're going to stop until 10:45, and we will have, at that time, our praise and our preaching service.